And we can move to the next presentation. Roy,
Hi, Nicola. Thank you very much.
it's your turn.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put up my presentation. Okay, so thanks very much. This is essentially sort of a complement to Hilton's model. What we've done is, over many discussions, Hilton and I have thought about how do we actually use this model and apply it to, I think, some of the questions that we're facing at the moment. So it's a sort of an applied model, applied paper using the model. And I'm very pleased we've had quite a discussion about the model. I mean, I think particularly the open economy issues are quite important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivation, the contribution. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the stylized facts about where we are at the moment in the fiscal position. Methodology, what we've tried to do is sort of reverse engineer the model, which I think is one of our contributions. And then to talk a little bit about the results in terms of fiscal sustainability and monetary policy, some counterfactual simulations, and if we have time, talk about debt stabilization after COVID-19, and then some concluding remarks. So what is the motivation contribution for this paper? Well, I think we all know where we are. R is greater than G, and the fiscal deficit is much more negative than the sustainable primary balance. So the primary balance at the moment is much more negative than the sustainable primary balance. And I'll talk a little bit about why that means we probably should be heading towards a consolidation. But it does, I think, lead directly to some of the points Andrea was making about the welfare implications of consolidation, and how does one do a consolidation that is coordinated between fiscal and monetary policy. So the contribution of this paper is to actually specifically evaluate policy options by including an estimate of welfare loss. We're still at early days on this, and we've had some ideas about what other welfare indicators we might use. And then to think a little bit more about the coordination with monetary policy, particularly as we go into a consolidation phase. I think that has been one of the things that we don't really always talk about, but to what extent can the fiscal and monetary policy authorities coordinate during the forthcoming consolidation? So I don't need to tell you all, there is a substantial literature on fiscal sustainability, not much on optimal policy in a DSGE. The DSGE we use here was the one you just seen, based on Kemp and Hollander, non-trivial role fiscal policy, etc. And then it's obviously calibrated to South African data, which makes it quite useful for our exercise. So what does the literature tell us? And these are some stylized facts. I'm going to dig into some of these in a little bit more detail. But essentially, we are in fiscal stress. Now, we've had a lot of philosophical conversations about whether or not we're in fiscal stress or in fiscal distress. I think we're in stress. R is greater than G, but we are heading towards a period of distress if we don't do anything about that. So firstly, R is greater than 6, and I'll explain how I get to that number. I know it's going to be quite an interesting, controversial number, because everybody's done their own calculations, and growth will not save us. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And we know that whatever we're doing at the moment is not working. Debt has not increased employment. There's been what Michael, I think, describes very nicely as austerity without consolidation. There's also been an element
Roy, you are the real rate.
No,
say bigger.
So R in terms of the average borrowing cost, I'll explain how I get to the number. But it's a nominal borrowing cost. Very important nominal. I know the financial stability view uses the real rate. No, we won't discuss the different approaches to that in a moment. Then, yeah, time and consistency, composition of spending, not growth enhancing, and the borrowing strategy increased R. Policy has been poorly coordinated, and we're operating in a second BIS world. Yes, let me get directly into that. So we all know the mathematics from Blanchard's 2019 AER address. The conditions for when debt stabilization can take place, particularly the finding, obviously, that when R is less than G, then you can essentially borrow with very little consequences, although I think both in the lecture and following up, he does highlight the fact that that's not necessarily the case. But the first thing that we need to do is to estimate an estimate of R, which is the nominal borrowing cost on government debt. We can't just obviously use an interest rate. The Treasury borrows across a different number of maturities and a different number of across the whole yield curve, and that does change from time to time, and that's also one of the issues I dig into a little bit here. And so you have to adjust for the maturity structure of debt. You can do it the long way, which is to take the current structure, because that is published by the Reserve Bank, and take the current structure of debt and the coupons on each of the debt instruments, and then to work out what the actual payments is across the entire yield curve. Or you can do what most people are doing at the moment, which is just to use an estimate of the debt service costs over the average balance, and then adjust for interest receipts and cash balances. So this is quite an important issue that comes up, particularly where we are in the fiscal cycle. Is the Treasury, like all good treasuries, when there is a bit of a wobble in the markets, is running with relatively high cash balances, just over 300 billion. Those cash balances earn interest, and so the borrowings of the Treasury are obviously the net debt and not the gross debt. And so when you try and estimate the borrowing costs of the Treasury, you have to take into account the interest earned on cash balances and the net debt position. And then you also finally have to adjust for tax receipts. Now, the really interesting thing that's happened in there was obviously incredible sell-off of debt during the course of last year. Foreigners dumped a lot of debt. There is a differential tax treatment between non-residents, banks, and pension funds. Non-residents generally don't pay tax on interest earned. Depending on the jurisdiction that they operate in, there is a whole system of tax treaties. Banks, however, do pay tax, and they often pay at 29%, where pension funds don't pay tax. Now, you may think this is just a little bit of a rabbit hole to go down, but when you have a significant sell-off from non-residents to banks, which is exactly what happened last year, the revenue earned from interest payments actually changes quite significantly, and revenue increases. It's almost like an automatic stabilizer, and it's one of the reasons why, well, not a huge reason, but one of the reasons why tax revenue has been relatively buoyant. And it's also one of the reasons why large offshore holdings of bonds are not a great thing. But when you're thinking through for proper sort of detailed fiscal sustainability calculation, you do actually have to take that into account. And so you can add all these things up, and then you can get debt service costs, the interest income that we receive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that gets you to a R adjusted of 6.8, 6.7, and 6.5 in nominal terms, which is lower than some other estimates I've seen. And it's lower in part because of this adding back of the interest income component, and you're using net debt. I'll talk a little bit more. Romain, go ahead.
How far can you go back to estimate this R adjusted? Over time.
I can technically go back to, I was going to put up a slide on it, but I didn't get around to it. I can technically go back to, I think, 1805, which is what the paper will contain.
Okay.
But it all depends on what, yeah, we do have data back actually about 200 or 300 years. I put out a paper earlier this year where I had 300 years of macro data.
Okay. No, very interesting.
But on this basis, you can go, on this basis specifically, we do properly, you can go back to about 1985.
Okay, no, this is very cool.
Yeah. And then, yeah, that gets you to understanding what the destabilizing primary balance would need to be, and the Treasury primary balance and R minus G. And then a fiscal adjustment required. So this is historically. Then what I do is I go forward into the future. So these are the last 3 years that you've just seen, 2018, 19, whatever. 2021, 22 is based on the June quarterly bulletin, because we now have updated nominal GDP numbers, and on the preliminary revenue and debt numbers that the Treasury put out, I think in March or also in April. So this gives us our what the as many people know, revenue was about 30 billion ahead of what was expected at the time of the budget, in part because of terms of trade effects, and in part because the economy has recovered even much more quickly in the last few months than we had previously thought. We also then have updated nominal growth numbers and all those things, and that gives us to a required fiscal adjustment to get back to sustainability in 21-22, which is obviously an enormous adjustment. 91 billion, 97 billion in 22-23, and only 45 in 23-24. But these are obviously very large adjustments, that fiscal adjustments that are required. And what I've just done here is, Romain, I think that hopefully this answers your question a little bit, but I've just plotted it back in time to 2001. And you can see that as I think most literature shows, often G is above R, but it went negative in 2016, 17. And then obviously there's this really interesting little bump here that takes place because there's been a huge boom in growth. And then here what I've done is just two different measures of G. One, which is estimate from Johan Fedeker, which is his potential G growth rate, and then obviously the Saab has also done more recent estimates. But this is probably, this dark line is probably a better estimate of what R minus G is in the longer run, because we're now using sort of stable values for both R and G. And that gives you a sense of what sort of the long run sustainable position would be. And this is what then goes into the model. So, you know, you can think about two measures for fiscal sustainability. One on the left-hand side is what you're trying to do is you're trying to achieve to take us back to a trend or long-run government debt to GDP ratio as the one way of thinking about how you achieve fiscal sustainability. And the other way of thinking about fiscal sustainability on the right-hand side is to take this approach and to look at trying to get rid of the fiscal sustainability gap, which is a much softer approach to fiscal sustainability, but is probably one which we can hopefully try and achieve. So that kind of gives you the context of the fiscal sustainability that we're trying to do. Just some other stylized facts from what is quite an enormous literature. I'm just going to go through these quite quickly. I think that we all know that the current fiscal approach is not working. I've seen this graph presented in a much more telling way, where the unemployment rate is on a different axis, and then the unemployment rate tracks debt to GDP. But essentially, we all know unemployment rate has risen while debt to GDP has risen. So there's definitely, I think, some merit in arguing that rising debt has not led to falling employment. There's also been an attempt at consolidation, but this consolidation has arguably been not working from a welfare perspective. What I've done here is just taken the forecast of spending on healthcare over different fiscal years, but the most recent forecast of spending on healthcare is essentially that in nominal terms, non-compensation healthcare will decline over the MTF. And if you look at the education projections, education spending growth will be slower than inflation. And then maybe something for the discussion in terms of the time and consistency about fiscal policy. What we have had is an expenditure ceiling, which has been the sort of fiscal rule, but for a variety of reasons, particularly maybe forecast errors, it has, and whether or not it is the right rule is also something for discussion. We have not delivered a credible consolidation, so debt continues to rise. And then the final point, but I think there's actually going to be a presentation on this tomorrow by Luchelle, because I know there's been a lot of interest on it, and I know a lot of the private sector economists have been writing about it. But is where I started by saying that obviously at the moment there is a large component of the Treasury is running on very large cash buffers, just over 300 billion, plus the very long dated maturity profile. Advice from one of my colleagues who's been at the Treasury since 1983 and has seen every single crisis that has taken place, and his advice: hold on as much cash as possible, and that's certainly what we've been doing. But the question is is this actually creating another source of fiscal drag? And what I've done here is just divided the interest received on the cash balances to get a sort of a shadow interest rate of interest on cash, and then compare that to R adjusted. And so the obvious point to make is that there is a gap, and that if the Treasury found different ways of investing its short-term cash or reduced gross debt relative to net debt, it could get a bit of a pickup. And then the final one is, the final two ones are this coordination issues. Bluevolt in a paper last year highlight the fact that because fiscal policy is seen as not providing sort of a credible forecast, it should move first and reduce the risk premium inflation expectations, which allow monetary policy to respond to weak growth. And then Hilton and I have just published a paper where we highlight a similar lack of coordination just off the global financial crisis between macro-prudential and other policies. And that gets us to sort of the final stylized point, which is the unfortunate one, which is to understand, given all of these things that we know, what are the options that we have at our disposal? Now, this comes from a recent paper by Blanchard, talking about the Indian situation, and does the fiscal, I think we've seen this paper, but does this travel to emerging markets. And the key point that they're making is naturally that countercyclical fiscal measures can be used to move demand back to supply. So essentially the application for advanced economies is that the objective of all the measures is to raise demand to meet supply. And this you can do where there's a large output gap, and fiscal policy is really trying to close the output gap. And obviously in advanced economies, tools are largely exhausted from a monetary policy perspective. They make the point that in a number of emerging markets, the situation is very different, that macro measures can't really be used because there is essentially a very small output gap and quite limited long-run supply. And this essentially is just a long way of saying that structural reforms are the only way to raise G, and that we know that these structural reforms will take quite a long time. And so really the optimal policy option, which is to raise long-run growth and to improve the fiscal position that way, is not available. And so you're actually only left with fiscal consolidation as your policy outcome. And that asks the question is, how do you go about doing it? And what is the least welfare way of doing it? And this is where use the model, and we had a good discussion earlier, I think, about how the model is set up between government consumption and government investment, but essentially to introduce a loss function into the model, which is, and then have the policymakers try and minimize losses. In this case, the loss function is calibrated to be deviations in output, and the variables themselves in effective weights. So just to think about it in terms of monetary policy is, to what extent is the Monetary Policy Authority also worried about the volatility of the interest rate? Or to what extent is the Fiscal Policy Authority worried about volatility of government consumption expenditure or government investment expenditure? It may well be not because they're worried about it from a pure sort of concern perspective, but also because it's quite difficult to make large changes in these variables over very short horizons. So you can introduce that specifically into the loss function. And then you could use that to develop sort of a simple feedback rules, quite standard ones in terms of thinking about that government expenditure is simply government expenditure in the loss period, minus obviously some analysis of the theta GY, which looks at the setting of the concern to what extent the fiscal authority is concerned about output, theta GB, which looks at the concern about debt, and this is for government consumption expenditure, and then you have a similar one for government investment. And this essentially provides sort of a fiscal rule, or a fiscal thought process for the Treasury to think about. And then you could add monetary policy in a very standard, tailored type reaction function. And the points I think are well made about possibly including international rates into this. And then policymakers choose these instruments to minimize the loss function. And that allows us to create sort of a set of different scenarios where the policymakers are looking at trying to minimize the loss function. Here, the yellow one indicates where the loss function is the least. These three columns give you the concern about the weights of the policy instruments in this part. So what we do here is we assume that there is no concern about the volatility of the actual instrument itself. So they set at 0. And we see that if you like, the loss minimizing response is actually where there's a significant change to both to government consumption expenditure, but very little change to government investment expenditure. I think this basically just provides you a way of essentially explaining what the model showed last time in the last presentation, which is that government consumption expenditure and government investment expenditure have very different effects on the economy. And then you can then also do this from a monetary policy perspective, and you can look at to what extent the monetary policy, optimal monetary policy can be used, and then you can do a coordinated approach where you do both monetary policy and fiscal policy. So basically what you're allowing for here is, firstly, you allow for, here we separate them out between the two, but what you allow for here is a scenario where there is fiscal policy, the Treasury uses government consumption expenditure and government investment expenditure to achieve fiscal sustainability, and then you add the monetary policy variable in discussion with those. And those kind of give you your optimal simple rules, which is to give you a sense of what the optimal approach might be and the optimal settings of the variables might be. Nicola, you've got your hand up. And Hilton may have to answer this question because it's his model.
No, because now the dynamic of the government expenditure then become important. Because essentially now with government expenditure, what you don't have a trade-off that you don't have with investment. Therefore, there is not a real cost of cutting government expenditure, because government expenditure actually has got a contractionary effect in the model.
In the model, yes.
Therefore, it's optimal because there is no cost, or the cost is much lower to cut government expenditure than to cut government investment, because investment has got a much bigger, which is, but then to be a bit, to the effect of government expenditure in that difference now matters a lot. No, there is a lot of question now. I open
exactly.
up a box.
I mean, I think intuitively that is the correct response. Obviously, because government investment expenditure has a lot of other positive effects on the economy, so cutting it, and also longer term effects. But this is where trying to include, and I think this is the first paper that we've seen that tries to do this explicitly, is actually tries to include a welfare component into the model. So at the moment, the minimization of welfare is with respect to output deviations, but you can think about perhaps having we have tried a bit actually but Hilton can come in on this. We have tried a bit to use other variables for welfare because the trade-off isn't that clear. There is an output trade-off, but there's also a welfare trade-off.
Yeah, we looked at I mean, this is output this is welfare stabilization, right? So it's not like a utility function welfare, firstly. So this is stabilization policy, and specifically it's output and debt, and output and the primary balance gap that we looked at. and Nicola, what you see exactly what you mentioned here is that, but it's actually true for both instruments, is that if you want to look at consolidation, if the goal of fiscal policy is consolidation, they need to adjust more aggressively to debt. And that's what you see quite clearly, is that those parameters will always kind of move towards being stronger in its debt adjustment. And you're right, that consumption.
Yeah, Andrea and Michael want to come in. Andrea.
Thanks. So Roy, absolutely. This is one of the only few papers that I've seen really where there's a loss function here that speaks to sort of welfare and fiscal policy over and above your typical kind of Taylor rule kind of approach. My concern with that though is that, have you thought about or looked into different definitions or calculations of your output gap and what that means for your loss function, right? Because I'm assuming when you're talking about output in your loss function, you're talking about an output gap. And you know, given the definitional issues around unobservables like that, it could have very damaging and volatile implications for fiscal policy. So this is number one. Number two, I mean, I'm not trying to sound contrarian just for the sake of sounding contrarian, but in your estimates around the required fiscal adjustment to stabilize debt, do you not think that actually we're in a markedly better position now, considering that required fiscal adjustment in the next kind of 2 or 3 years is literally half of what we all thought it was 12 months ago? I mean, it's literally half, and 0.5 to 0.6% of GDP is not a big adjustment, right? By emerging market standards, this should be relatively easy. So, I mean, how do you think about that? What is your response to that? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll do the second question, and then I'm going to ask Hilton to do the first one. No, absolutely. I mean, this has been quite. I mean, I think you and I actually have spoken about this separately, but and I think a lot of the analysts are now coming out in the last few months. I mean, the GDP numbers that we've seen obviously have suggested a much stronger economy than we previously thought. If I go to what I have done, and this is before, obviously, before any adjustments that will come out in the August status A release, right? Which, you know, I think some people have even said that might lift. Who knows what will happen because we're rebasing. But what I've done here is I've just plugged in, as I think many people have done, I've just plugged in the most recent numbers and then projected them forward using very conservative assumptions. And I only get to fiscal adjustment required in 23, 24, 45, which is a lot smaller than we had previously anticipated. But the most important thing is that this does still rely on the Treasury achieving its wage outcomes. So one of the things I still want to do is to run the fiscal sustainability gap under those two different scenarios. So what would you have to achieve if you didn't get the wage negotiations? Because remember, we're all still working on quite. I can now say these things because I don't work for the National Treasury anymore. But obviously these forecasts are quite dependent on that. But the fiscal adjustment is becoming I must say, I think the fiscal adjustment is becoming increasingly achievable, particularly if you can get a few things right.
Yep, agree.
Roy, but those are flows, right? So that's for the period. That's the fiscal adjustment for that period. So in other words, if you're looking at 2023, 24, it's saying, sorry. Someone said I must stop my video. If you're looking at 2023, 24, that's the adjustment that would stabilize debt in that fiscal year.
Yeah.
Right. So you'd still have all that accumulated $500 billion there. Thanks for coming, and the 90 billion and the 97 billion. And that's if you're happy with that debt. I really enjoyed Eric's characterization of ring fencing in crises times. But you know, we would think it would be nice to ring fence that and to see, you know, what the COVID adjustment was versus what it would have been without COVID. That's something else we can maybe look into.
Yeah, I mean, this has been, I think, the great discussions between Hilton and I has been, what is actually fiscal sustainability? Is it I mean, I think where we all are at the moment in the cycle, I think we'd all just be happy with stabilizing debt. But there is a very deep question about whether the total level of debt is right.
Michael Sachs might answer this. Michael.
I hope so.
Well, I would say the first thing is it's got very little to do with the level of debt and everything to do with the level of debt service costs, which I think Eric Lieper also mentioned yesterday. But my question is, and maybe this question I should have asked in the last presentation, but I was unable to attend most of it. So maybe it was answered there as well in the previous paper. But what is government investment, and in what sense is it a policy variable that policymakers have control, that budget or fiscal authorities have control over? Because the last time I checked, or the actual capital spending on budget is about 7% of the budget or 8% of the budget, and it's largely social infrastructure that is part of a set of complementary inputs that provides the real estate needed for government consumption. So we've seen, like in the last couple of weeks, fancy new shiny hospitals built for COVID, but no staff. So you kind of got government investment, but insufficient government consumption to make that government investment effective. But so the reason I'm asking, is it a policy variable? What are we talking about here? Is it ESCOM and Transnet and things like that? And in that case, it's not really. I mean, I know we kind of pay these things. We support ESCOM and Transnet out of the budget, but that it shouldn't be our assumption that we're not supposed to be supporting them. They're supposed to have their own infrastructure programs, which are linked to user charges. And so when we say when we identify kind of the multiplier effects or the impulse response of government investment shocks, what do we have? Is it police stations and hospitals and schools that we're talking about here, which is what is financed on the budget, or is it kind of power stations and ports? And if it's the latter, in what sense is it a fiscal policy variable?
Well, now that I've worked for a province, I can now answer you, Michael. I now get to see on the ground how we spend money, and you're quite right. I mean, it's our largest two spending investment spending components are obviously education and health, and they are just, and actually increasingly the spending is just on maintenance. I mean, if we can keep up the maintenance of these things, and that's really where the money's going at the moment. No new construction. However, obviously there's a large component that's roads, and that also is largely maintenance. So this idea that there's these magical infrastructure investments that will crowd in growth right now, I think I agree with you, is not completely clear, partly because a lot of it is actually just maintenance. But then that maintenance probably has spillover effects that are broadly positive for the economy. I mean, spending money on roads and infrastructure and cement and etc. It's probably good for the economy.
But I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm too fiscally and not macroeconomic. But in the fiscal accounts, maintenance and consumption.
Eric, you want to come in?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm. I thought I was muted. I think this conversation is really underscoring how hard this stuff is. One of the points, though, that I think needs to be brought in, and it's already been hinted at. Is there a way of differentiating which components of spending and taxes are highly inertial? I think about the example of Obamacare. That thing got passed. It was incredibly popular with the voters. And even when the Republicans were in power, they couldn't get rid of it. And so when you start thinking about fiscal consolidations, I think we've got to constrain ourselves to talk about the parts that really could be changed, that are politically feasible to change. You understand what I'm getting at?
Mm.
And that's really requiring the kind of nitty-gritty conversation that's going on right now. Really thinking hard about which components are changeable, which ones aren't, and it could be for political reasons mostly. So I don't know. I mean, I always find these fiscal consolidation questions really hard to think about. And the same thing with, you guys already said this about sustainability. What does that really mean? From a market standpoint, sustainability is all forward looking. It's all about, can you anchor expectations on there will be the surpluses needed? But a lot of the fiscal analysis that I see about sustainability is more backward looking. It's assuming that the existing rules remain in place forever. How far can you go? And I would like to see more forward-looking thinking about these sustainability issues, because that's what the market is looking at. That's pretty much all I have to say.
Maybe Mamokete, when you do you want to come in as well, and then we close with Roy. Roy will answer the question and finish. Yeah, Mamokete.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm gonna come in there, and I think what's interesting is that I'm sort of like talking to the last point that Eric's just made. So when you measure fiscal sustainability, and you look at the primary deficit that you need to get to fiscal sustainability, and my question is fiscal sustainability not much more a function of what's the word I'm looking for? Fiscal risk. So the risk that you take when you run with, that's the word I was looking for, fiscal vulnerability. So my sense would be that post the COVID crisis, you sit in a much more vulnerable state, which means the probability that you will go into crisis has increased dramatically. So you might be running with a certain amount of debt, but you are much more vulnerable. So, you know, economic cycles come and go. So at some point you have to think in your head that you're going to run into another recession, that your fiscus is going to come under renewed stress, and your ability to weather that crisis when it arrives is hugely circumscribed versus what it would have been before the current crisis. So what is sustainable at this point would be an absolute reduction in debt. So you have to move into a primary surplus. As long as you're running primary deficits for the next 2 to 3 years, your vulnerability remains, which means the risk that you get into crisis remains as high, and the possibility that you don't make it through the next crisis is very high. So what is a crisis? What is sustainability in that case?
Wait, I'll give you the last words. Try to answer the question. Give the main message, final message of the paper, because we are.
Oh, okay. I've got a few more slides, but I'll be very quick with those.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I completely agree. I think Eric's point is spot on, which is, and this has been a discussion point between Hilton and I quite a lot, is what is fiscal sustainability? And I think, interestingly, Mamoketa's response, because she is from the market, is in line with the view that, you know, it is in a way what the market thinks it is. It is what they, you know, it is almost a deeper question. It's about, do you actually think that this institution or this country will be able to repay its debts in 10 years' time? For a whole variety of reasons. You know, if there's another shock, if there's another this, what are the political structures, what are the governance structures, and so forth. I mean, if you look at the Standard & Poor's methodology for looking at ratings, it's quite a detailed methodology. But if you distill it down, it's really, in a way, about the old-fashioned reasons for people to, when you lend money to someone, is character and cash flow is almost the two big things. And character talks to governance. Does the borrower want to pay back the money? Do they have a history of paying back money? And cash flow is, do they have the physical resources to pay it back? So I think Eric's spot on, and I think I agree with you about the need to differentiate about what could be cut and what couldn't be cut. Unfortunately, in this country, for some whatever reason, I find it quite surprising. Social grants are easy to cut, which is also problematic because I think that also has long-term welfare implications that we haven't quite thought through. Education is easy to cut, also long-term welfare implications, and so forth, and health. But oddly enough, other things aren't easy to cut, and so we keep on spinning up. Okay, I'll be quite quick to Hilton. Do you want to answer any of the questions? I think on the output gap in the welfare.
I gave you the word to Roy.
Okay,
Roy,
I'll finish.
I can follow up with Andrea on the output
Okay.
gap. And Mamaketa raised some good points, but juicy ones as usual. And I would love to chat more about it as well.
Yeah.
We should
Okay,
do it
I'll
because
fly
it's-
to the end. I would say I blame Hilton for today. So we ran some counterfactuals. I'll go through these very quickly, where we look at the different options. Essentially, the counterfactuals tell you what you expect from the initial results, which is that, and I think these two slides really tell the story, which is that if you have a fiscal consumption reduction, we call it fiscal both, which is a combined consumption investment thing, but it's essentially mainly fiscal consumption, and you compare that to doing only investment, then actually debt to GDP ratio comes down much more than it would have generally. And importantly, you don't have any significant output losses as a result. So you can actually, using this model, and obviously lots of assumptions around consumption, you can deliver improved fiscal trajectory by reducing consumption expenditure. And then we just go through the scenarios about sustainability gap. Obviously, one of the ways this comes through is through the fact that the long rates are lower under all scenarios than they would have been, because fiscal position is better, and that is in the model. Similar on the short run. We've done some initial analysis on COVID. Basically, COVID really throws everything out because essentially you've got a very high government debt to GDP ratio that you're trying to get back to some kind of trend, and that's an enormous fiscal consolidation, which is probably not feasible right now. But in many ways, COVID will deal with itself, as you have nominal growth being very, very strong. A little bit of help from terms of trade. We may actually get into 22, 23, 24 relatively okay from a G perspective. And so the challenge then is R. So in summary, the optimal policy response is structural interventions to raise G, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. So without that, to get to fiscal sustainability, we need consolidation. But that these come with short-term welfare consequences. And I think trying to sharpen up the welfare implications is going to be one of the next steps. Welfare losses are minimized when the consolidation is gradual. Achieves reductions in government consumption is coordinated. And then obviously we're trying to avoid a hard consolidation. One thing I didn't have much time to talk about, but is coming out in a paper, hopefully between Nick Spowell and I later in this year, which is that currently the way that we do intergovernmental transfers really makes it quite difficult to protect frontline services like health and education. Decisions on health and education are not made at the center, they're made in subnational level, and there are lots of other decisions that are made at other subnational levels. And the problem is that when you do a significant fiscal consolidation, the cuts are passed through the system, and often, I think directly to Eric's point, they're often done in the wrong places, often in what is easy and not in what is going to improve spending in the long run. And then I've discussed a little bit about the improving the borrowing strategy for growth. So I hope I finished quickly enough.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was great. Thank you. And I remind everybody that we will both have the video and the presentation will be posted online so that you can go back. There is a few questions on the Q&A chat that I couldn't bring in. If you want to interact, you can. But you can interact and use the chat function as well if you want to ask something specifically to the presenter. Roy, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you, Hilton.